World of RPGs, Episode 13, Japan. Welcome to the World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host Mo Bots, and in Episode 13 we are going to Japan. This is another one of the big ones, and before we begin, let's start with some news. So yes, this is a bit late, basically because I had deadlines at work, and I also went to a conference in the UK and got to visit two gaming stores in Edinburgh, Ancient Robot Games and Black Lion Games, both of which were awesome. And I also found some locally made TTRPGs, which I posted on my social media channels. Of course, they're written in English. There's also some other news in gaming. We're in the submissions period of the annual Indie Games Award called The Awards, which is going from April to the end of May 2024. The organizers looking to expand the awards beyond the English-speaking countries, so go check out the link in the show notes if you think you're eligible. We also have some good news from Ukraine. First of all, the crowdfunding for Archaeterica is going until May 6th, 2024. I interviewed the creator of the game, Anton Relikt, in episode 7 of this podcast. Also, if you're listening to this episode right after it came out, you still might have the chance to visit the second iteration of Roleplay Ukraine, an online gaming convention with talks and English language gaming groups hosted by the Ukrainian TTRPG community. And that will be from May 3rd to May 5th, 2024, and I'm really looking forward to it. Finally, I've managed to start working on my own game system for real now, but it's not even finished, so I can't really tell you much about it, apart from that it's heavily inspired by my interviews in this channel. Speaking of this channel, let's get into the actual episode. To be honest, it was kind of tricky to research this one, because while there's a lot of material on role-playing in Japan, most Japanese role-players only speak Japanese. The country has a long history of TTRPGs, so like in France or Germany, you can pretty much get into the hobby and play for 20 years or more without ever having had to read or speak English. I keep the country info short because I assume you've heard of Japan before. They have a population of about 125 million people, and the main language is Japanese, which forms its own language family together with the indigenous languages of the islands in southern Japan. To explain Japanese writing would probably take its own episode, since they basically have 3 different writing systems, some of it taken from Chinese characters. Religion-wise, there's the local Shinto faith, but also strong Buddhist influences with specific Japanese adaptations. My own connection to Japan is a bit funny, because although I've never been to the country, we actually had a Japanese family live with us for a few months when I was a child. So I picked up things like Japanese children's books and toys back in the 80s. So to get started, let's begin with a Japanese player and his experiences.
My name is Yosuke Miyajima, and on Twitter, I use Mayosuke. I live in Tokyo for about 20 years. I've known about TTRPGs since I was a kid, and my first encounter was D&D's Red Box basic set. So I found it at a local hobby store. Since I was a kid, it was very expensive to buy. So I saved money and finally I bought it. After that, I tried to play several times with my friends. But at that time, it was a little bit difficult for us to play properly. So after several trials, unfortunately, we stopped playing. And then almost 20 to 30 years have passed. In 2022, I didn't know why, but I decided to play D&D again. And I went to a TTRPG cafe in Tokyo. And after that, I became an active, especially D&D player.
And what other games do you play except D&D?
In addition to D&D, I play Pugmire. Also, it's a 5e hack. And Dungeon World. And Fate Core. One Ring. And recently, Cairn.
So I've heard that there are also games made specifically in Japan. Have you played any of these?
Yeah, so as I said, I mostly play Western TTRPGs. I think I haven't played Japanese RPGs yet.
If you play Western fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons, do you have the books translated into Japanese?
D&D and Pugmire, there are Japanese translated versions, and those are translated by professionals. For Dungeon World, there is a Japanese translation on the internet, but there is no published books. And One Ring RPG, there is also a Japanese translation. And for Cairn, there is also a Japanese version.
And is there anything strange in these books for you as a Japanese reader? Like in Dungeons and Dragons, is there anything where you think this thing from Western countries, D&D is from the USA, is really strange or I don't understand it?
From the perspective of Japanese culture, I think in the past D&D editions, before 5e, there are several strange Eastern Asian flavors in D&D settings. But when I started playing 5e, I think there's no huge strange part related to East Asian cultures, especially Japanese cultures. It is simply omitted, I think.
Okay, can you give an example for these things in the older editions?
In Forgotten Realms, there is a Karatua region in the east side of Forgotten Realms. So a lot of older D&D players know what Karatua is. But when I checked 5e books, there is no mentioning about Karatua, I think. I don't know why, but maybe it's because how to translate real Japanese or East Asian culture into fantasy elements. Maybe it is out of date, they thought.
Of course, I had to ask about the kobold again.
In D&D world, it's a kind of wizard folk, especially it's a draconic folk, I think. My first encounter was a kind of doggy folk, so dog-faced humanoids. I think I say kobold as dog-faced humanoids its origin is early D&D. But I think in Japan, of course, that D&D is the origin. But maybe in the 80s, so Wizardry, a fantasy RPG video game. I think the maker of Wizardry referenced D&D Monsters Manual, maybe. So in Wizardry, Kobold is pictured as dog-faced humanoids. And for a lot of old Japanese, Wizardry's Kobold's image is very memorable. And Wizardry left a huge impact for fantasy-loving Japanese people. So out of us, still think Kobold is a dog-faced humanoid.
If you play, where do you play? At home or in a shop? How do you organize it?
So mostly I go to a shop for playing TTRPG. My house doesn't have enough space for inviting my friends. And those TTRPG shops are located in very convenient locations, so near big stations. So I mostly go there.
And then do you always play with the same people as a campaign, or do you play one shots?
Mainly, I play with same members, and sometimes I play one shot.
And you said you're also a dungeon master.
Yeah, sometimes I DM.
Do you create your own adventures or do you use published modules?
Mostly I use published adventures, and sometimes I try to make my own adventure as a one shot.
And these published modules, are these translations from English ones or are there unique Japanese modules?
I think for a lot of Japanese D&D players, including me, it's very common to use translated official D&D adventures. And there are also Japanese original. Original means it's not official, but it is made by indie fans. But there are a lot of good fan-made D&D adventures.
So these fan-made adventures, do they have anything unique, like connections to Japanese culture?
Some fan-made adventures have relation to Japanese cultures, but most of Japanese fan-made D&D adventures doesn't have not so much relation to Japanese cultures.
In China and South Korea, they have a lot of influences from Japan, from TTRPGs. They also play translated games. There's one Japanese game which is also available in English called, I don't know how to say it, Ryutama.
Ah, yes, Ryutama.
And this one is popular, I think.
So speaking of Ryutama, I go to a TTRPG shop, Monodrako, and the owner of Monodrako developed Ryutama.
And a slight correction, Atsuhiro Okada is actually the manager of the shop and not the owner. To find out more about Ryutama and other Japanese games, I talked to one of the translators of the game.
All right, my name is Andy Kitkovsky. I live in Japan. I work in IT as my day job. And I got into RPGs at a kind of a young age, not through Dungeons & Dragons, amazingly enough, as an American, but interestingly enough, I was big into science fiction when I was a kid, and the Dungeons & Dragons company, TSR, created a science fiction game called Star Frontiers, which by today's standards is actually not very good, but it was a science fiction RPG, and they actually had commercials for it on TV. And my father and I saw that and we're like, that looks interesting. So we bought it and took a look at it. Unfortunately, because at the time, the pedagogy of RPGs was so underdeveloped, the concept of Star Frontiers is, oh, well, you're already familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, so you know how to play RPG, so we're just going to get right into it. Didn't really give you an advice or even show you, like, what is an RPG? So we looked at it like it was some sort of like a board game, question mark, that we are supposed to play on somehow and create stories. We're not sure how this works. So it took me like a few more years to crack it and understand it. But once I started getting into that, I got hooked on the idea that you can create stories with your friends. So Star Frontiers was my entry point to RPGs way back when I was like in elementary school, I think, late elementary school. And then from that point on, it was all sorts of other games, mostly non-D&D, but D&D a lot as well.
Okay, so which games are you playing now?
Right now, I've got a number of groups right now, but I've got a group of friends in Yokohama, and we are currently playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. One of my friends is game mastering for the first time, and it's so interesting watching him approach this as a first-time GM in his 30s or so. And it's his first year also playing RPGs at all. So he fell into it and just got really excited and is doing a great job. On the side right now, I'm currently running Godbound, which is a fantasy version of D&D. Yeah, I know my tastes are actually not really D&D centric, but it just so happens that right now at this time, I'm doing a lot of D&D and D&D adjacent games. But Godbound is a great game. It's basically like a very high superhero level fantasy. And as well as that, I'm also at a local Japanese goth bar in Yokohama for some friends from time to time. I run them through Cthulhu Dark. They're big fans of the Call of Cthulhu and Cthulhu Mythos. I'm not a big fan of the rules, so we've been using the one-page Cthulhu Dark rules, and that's been going wonderful. We've been going through some classic kind of Call of Cthulhu scenarios in Japanese, and I've been running it using a very simple system, so it's working for all of us.
Okay, so let's have a look at the games you've worked on. So you're actually known for having translated Japanese games.
Yes, translated and published, but I need to also confirm that while I'm kind of the center of the publisher, the translation work has been a lot with my partner, Matt Sanchez. He's even much faster, more detail-oriented than I am when it comes to translations. We've been working together for about 10 years now on various games. Well, the first one I published, I didn't do much translation, but I did a lot of localization in it, was Made RPG with Aaron Clooney, who now has his own shop with Starline Publishing, and they do some other games as well. So Made was kind of our first cut our teeth on this whole RPG translation and publishing thing. That was somewhere between 12 to 15 years ago. Then after that, a long-time project that I was involved with, a very large book called Tenra Bansho Zero. That was sort of the first license to be picked up, although it was the second one to be published, of Japanese RPGs in English. So Tenra Bansho Zero, which is basically a feudal era on another planet, Japan, but with magic and mechas and high tech and sorcery and all sorts of stuff. Sort of like a game that seems like Rifts or just everything thrown together, but it has a very, very, very Japanese cultural mindset, and the rules are very interesting too.
So when was that originally published in Japan?
The original version was 1997. The revised version, aka the Zero Edition, was published in 2000, I believe.
Okay, and you said there's something interesting about the rules. What is that?
It looks on the front like an average D6-based dice pool system. You have a number that is represented by your stat. So like I might have a 7 in agility. That means I roll 7 dice. And then I might have a skill that has like 1, 2, or 3, or potentially 4 if it's really powerful, pips. So if I roll 7 dice and my skill is 2, which is basic, anything that comes up a 1 or 2 is a success. I count up successes, and that sees if I, beat the other guy or beat the background or whatever. Very kind of standard system. But the interesting on top of that is there's this whole economy of what's called karma. And it goes into a very Japanese Buddhist karma, not a Hindu karma. So basically, the more you exert yourself and the more you basically use these kind of power tokens to boost your abilities and do crazy anime hyper things, you have a great chance of success. But at the same time, you start accumulating karma. And if you accumulate too much karma and you can't reduce it, you become an NPC, but it's kind of like the Dark Jedi thing. Like you were evil the whole time, or you became evil at some point. So it's a very interesting take on, you have these powerful characters to begin with, but they're always kind of riding this edge of like, they can lose their humanity. And the system is very structured like a kabuki theater. So it's got scenes and acts, but then they have these intermission scenes. That's where all the bookkeeping is done. And when you look at it, basically has the sort of the theme. And when you give these tokens around to give basically the other players praise for their good role playing or interesting things they do, it's very much like a classic old school, not modern, but more old school kabuki theater, where people cheer on the actors as they're in the middle of the play. So it'd be like if you're watching Hamlet and there's some guy named Dave who's doing a great job being Hamlet, and he gives his badass line, you might scream out, "Way to go, Dave! That's awesome, Dave!" from the audience. That's how kabuki theater works in Japan. And so you'd sort of do that at the table by giving people tokens when they do really good role playing or stand out in some way.
Okay, that sounds cool. So the second one you worked on was Ryutama?
Yes. So Tenra was a lot mostly me. I did get some translations from others, but then I had to rescale and rewrite and relocalize, although Aaron helped quite a bit on a few sections. But that was sort of my baby. The next one was Ryutama, and that was definitely mostly Matt working. We basically split up the workload as we did, but that was a lot of his input. I want to make sure in these interviews that it doesn't seem like I'm just, this guy that does everything myself. If it weren't for all the people that were around me, these things wouldn't have happened. But yeah, so Ryutama was ours. He came up with the idea first. He even contacted Okada Atsuhiro first. And then after some time, me and Matt met and we joined together and, first as sort of collaborators and then as really good friends. And then we became friends with Okada over time too, the author of Ryutama. And then that became our next project. The original Ryutama was somewhere around 2005 to 2008. So it's 20 years or so soon. But yeah, so that one was the next one we brought out in English. The interesting part about that one is, it's very unlike Tenra, but at the same time, it's called a natural fantasy RPG. And a lot of it is actually very old school. If you look at the way that the rules work, it's with things like turn-based combat, hit points, spell points. There's encumbrance and stuff like that. It's very classical, like old school D&D. So when you look at the art, it looks like a Studio Ghibli, like wonderful heartwarming sort of game, but in play it can actually be a little bit brutal. But the interesting parts there is that the game is very good at pedagogy. It's like a Japanese take on RPG pedagogy, in that when Okada was back in the day, he actually started and created the most successful RPG cafe, not just board games, but RPG focused cafes in the world, but in Japan as well. And in doing so, one of the things he wanted to do was train a new generation of game masters, because in Japan, Japanese players will look upon the game master as kind of like a godlike entity. Like, oh, I could never run a session like that. It's just not that it's too hard, but I couldn't put myself out there. I would screw it up. I would not be as good as the people who ran for me. There's less of a resistance overseas, like in the US and stuff like that, in the West, to being a GM, but there's a lot more resistance to being a GM in Japan, especially since there's nothing easy that sort of walks you through it. A lot of people kind of stumble into the role because no one else would do it. But in Japan, he wanted to increase the number of game masters, so he basically made this game that had a lot of good advice for new game masters. It had a lot of basics of RPGs, things like rolling various dice, not just D6s or D20. And also things like the ability to use spells that seem insignificant or not very useful, but if you use them in useful ways, you can get over problems and overcome obstacles. That's a very old school D&D, original D&D way of looking at things. And also it gives a lot of advice for GMs, and first-time GMs have these special rules they can access, which basically lets them do things like official do-overs, or official boosting, like it enables them to above the table, not just behind the curtain, but above the table to be like boost player abilities. For example, if the fight looks like it's going really bad because the GM didn't really think ahead and this one ability caught him by surprise and it looks like the player's going to get wiped out, they can have this GM character that can kind of show up and doesn't just save the day like, GM PCs traditionally do, which is kind of dumb. It actually has rules that you use to basically to engage in front of everyone that gives you like a bonus to players. Or if it's the other way, if the monsters are getting completely trounced, he or she can make the monsters a little more powerful. It seems, like, well, why do I need the rules so that the GM can do that? This is for first-time GMs, where in Japan especially, where if they make a mistake, even if the players don't really notice, they get kind of in their heads at times. Oh man, I screwed that up. What am I going to do? And having these rules as part of the game makes it such that the player says it's okay to do over, because the rules are, not the rule doesn't just say golden rule, you can do what you want. It actually gives me advice and gives me a rule that I can implement that says, let me do that over. So for that, it was a great game for teaching GMs. I will hold to this day, I'm very familiar with the world of, Japanese RPGs. There hasn't been a game that has, there are games that are kind of newbie focused, or games that are easy to GM, like Stellar Knights and especially new wave games that are coming out these days, but not a game that has really sort of deconstructed what are the keys to being a good GM for pretty much any kind of role-playing game. And then let's build up a game that teaches those things, as Rutama has. There's two levels to that game, which is why I love it a lot. There's the natural fantasy of not just killing things, but going from places and meeting people and helping people with common problems. That's the other thing about the game, is that, it is sort of traditional, but you get some experience points for defeating monsters in combat. And there's a combat system. But you actually get far more experience, 10 times more, by traveling to new places and meeting new people and going to new towns and stuff like that. So there's this whole, let's explore the world. Let's meet people. Let's help them with their mundane problems aspect of the game that's really built into the core. And on top of that, the secondary layer is the part where it teaches people how to GM, or teaches experienced GMs how to GM just a little bit better. So that's why that one is still amazingly successful. I couldn't believe it sold this much, but it's still getting love all around the world with multiple editions in various languages after all this time, because of those two strong elements that people have been kind of waiting for, I guess. We didn't expect it to be that successful when it came out, but it kind of blew our minds.
Yeah, you also just sold it to me, and I'm kind of sad because I was at a conference in the UK at the beginning of the month where I could have gotten games at a decent price, not like here. So I'm like, oh no, why didn't I get it? But I did get a game I was looking for a long time from the US, which is hard to get in Europe. So 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, without having to pay $30 postage.
That's a great one too, yeah. There's also a Japanese version of that coming out soon too. Actually, it's currently in PDF form, but it looks like they may consider a physical form in the future.
So the third one I see here on the website is Shinobigami.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so Shinobigami, and this one's a little bit more sensitive because we had a Kickstarter a while back and just things happen, political stuff, depression stuff on all accounts, and then just a couple of hurdles that just sprung up. So we're kind of late on fulfillment on that one in terms of we promised 2 books. The second book is coming out in electronic form in the next month, hopefully by the time this goes up or a little bit after that. And the physical book's coming out soon after that. So everything is contained in the first book, though there is a second book if you want to that has like expansion and rules and stuff like that. But Shin Obigami is another one of Matt and I's favorites. And again, this is one where Matt brought it to me. I said, well, this is going to be kind of hard. I don't know if we're going to be able to do this. And then we went to the publisher and they're like, in terms of can we get the license? And sure enough, we were already kind of aware of the publishers. They're a little bit like friendly with them and then became friends over time with them. So it was kind of a no-brainer to do that as well. But that Shin Obigami is another one of our favorites. And that's very much in line with our strategy. We have a company, but we feel very little like a company. It's more just 2 guys doing this as their hobby. Or actually 4, because now we have 2 people we regularly work with as contractors. But our strategy is not to look at something that's going to make money overseas, something we want to publish to get us that money. We look at things that we've looked at, we like, we enjoy ourselves, and we love the heck out of it. And that's the games we pick to translate and publish, rather than the ones that look like they're going to be, monetarily successful. Although there's some great ones out there. And Shin Obigami is just a phenomenal. Again, I guess my background is, way back in college, I used to study like sociology and a lot of things having to do with pedagogy. And Shin Obigami is another game that has some very interesting training wheels on it in terms of a new way to show an RPG to learn how an RPG works in a new way. And that is basically, if you don't mind for a moment, Shin Obigami kind of started a revolution in Japan about 10, 12 years ago. Basically, this company, Boken, a fine publisher of RPGs, at the time second tier, probably their first tier now of RPGs. They again have some goals in mind. They're like, what are the common complaints about RPGs? Well, one of them is that it takes too long for a GM to learn to get to the table. It takes too long for players to learn. So you have to do all this heavy lifting before you get to the table, first of all. Then after that, it takes a long time to get into the characters and stuff like that. So what they proposed was a game where you can read it and understand it very quickly, where you have an example of play that covers everything from character generation and player introductions all the way to the finish of the game as text in the rulebook. So not just, here's an example of combat. David is going to roll a blah, 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 and he rolled an X for hit and X for damage. And then Sarah is going to shoot some arrows. Not just that, the entire thing from the very start to the very end, curtains close. The entire text of a role-playing game session, a good role-playing game session at that, completely converted to text. What's called a replay in Japan. It's like a screenplay version of a text, and then put that in the book. And not only put that in the book, put that in the front of the book. So that when you open the book, it's about A5, so it's about the size of your hand. So it's a kind of a smaller form factor. The first half of the book is just the replay. By going through it, and you have these little notes at the bottom that explain what is happening in the text. So someone might say something, and it might be a joke or something like that, and then at the bottom it explains what the joke is. Or it might they say, like, I'm going to make a blankety-blank roll. At the bottom it says, that roll does this. So you read this thing, and it's very light reading. I mean, you can read it probably in an hour or two. So the idea there is like you pick it up on your way home from your job, and on your way home on your commute, you can read it, the whole book, or at least the whole replay. And by the time you get off the train, you understand what a good session of the game looks like, what are the core rules that are used over and over again, and just what a healthy group of players together, what kind of fun they can have. So you get a blueprint of not only what kind of roles and rules there are, but also how the players come together and what sort of interactions they have and what to expect at the table and what things might blind them at the table. So you get this whole blueprint of the session before you even crack the rules part. The rules part's the second half of the book. And basically, that was the first thing, to show people very quickly what the game looks like, how it plays out. The second thing is the rules aren't very complicated. And the idea behind this series of games, because this was the second book in a series of these games called Dice Fiction, Psychofiction, which is basically the concept is you pick it up, the GM can read it and understand it in about 2 hours. Like, to get that time from buying the book to playing at the table condensed as fast as possible. So this is in that line. It's still popular to this day, the most popular one. And that's because of some other factors I'll get to in a minute. So the second half of the book has all the rules, and basically the players make characters relatively quickly. So, within about an hour, everyone has characters, and then you play for about 2 to 3 hours, kind of like a Fiasco style where you go around the table 3 times, and then there's a showdown, and then the curtains close, and that's it. Then after that, you're like, well, if you wanted to play again, you can play the character you were in the last session, or we can make up new characters, or we can have some people make up new characters and some people play old characters. You have that sort of, choice. But every session is like a sit down to the table, to close is about 4 hours for 4 people, maybe even 5. And again, to condense that speed of buying the book to getting it to the table was the core concept of that. And it works. It just flat out works. It's phenomenal. And then the rules are pretty simple. The cool thing about Shinobigami is that it's like 1/3 of a role-playing game, 1/3 of a German-style strategy game, because there's some intricate combat things that go on, and 1/3 a secret role game like Werewolf or Mafia. And that is that the GM basically creates a scenario where it's usually something as simple as everyone wants to try to get the MacGuffin. There's something out there and all the characters need to get it and hold it to the end of the session, and then, quote unquote, you win. But then the GM slides each player a secret. And these secrets might be, your character is secretly the older sister or brother of that character over there, so you have to protect them. Or your clan is trying to outmaneuver the other clans, so your goal is completely something else. You have to make friends with 2 other players. Doesn't matter who it is or what kind of friends you are, just make 2 friends. Or some other side goals. So you have these secret goals that everyone has. And then you basically spend the next 2 hours, whatever, playing to those goals, but also doing some pretty interesting role-playing. Very scene-focused. So it's like, okay, this is your scene. Who do you want in the scene? What are you doing? Let's go. Roll. You only have like 1 die roll per scene as well. And then when the combat happens, it's fast, strategic. It's got some sort of German board game elements to it. You have to plan a few things in advance, and there are some win conditions you have to aim for. It can get pretty strategic if you want to, but also if you don't want to do that, you can just fall back on the role-playing and the secret agenda stuff too. So there's a lot of games in this line. There's one that's kind of like a dark Harry Potter, which also kind of has a frenemy style. There's 3 types of ways you can play. One is there is the GM will create a sort of a bad guy NPC, and the 4 characters are supposed to meet. They might have little conflicts with each other, but ultimately their goal is to defeat the big bad guy. The second way of playing is there is a goal, and there is perhaps a quote-unquote bad guy, but the characters are going to be a little more at each other's throats. So they're going to be frenemies. They're going to have some that are completely rivals and some that are completely friends. And part of the game is to understand who is who and try to figure out who's on your side and who's not. And the third type is basically a free-for-all where everyone is against everyone, but that's usually not as fun. It's more bloodthirsty, and it's not really that interesting because everyone's going to be against each other. But the middle one, the one where you have a potential NPC in the background, like an antagonist NPC, but at the same time, the players are half friends, half enemies. They want to work together, but they also have an idea, sort of like a German board game with cooperation, where they want to cooperate to some degree, but they also want to come out on top. So that's usually the most fun way, because the GM is there to basically give everyone those secrets at the beginning, to set the stage, and then they just watch things happen and react to them. And then the rest of the game, the rest of the action usually just happens by watching it. So the GM doesn't have to constantly steer and create a deep scenario with maps and stuff at the beginning. They just say, they fire a pistol in the air. Here's the start, go. And then they watch how things happen. And then, they usually have a few set things. What is the antagonist NPC's goal? What is their secret? What are the player secrets? But beyond that, they don't have a lot of control over what happens. So a lot of it is watching what the players bring to the table. So that becomes very exciting. The fact that you have very little setup at the beginning, you have to watch all this stuff unfold. And just the fact that it's so easy to run, it's definitely a favorite of Matt's and myself. So that book is out. It's in PDF and it's in physical format. The second book is coming out this year. And there's also a deluxe version, which is basically the both books in one. And the other interesting thing is every single book has its own replay. So the second book introduces alternate rules for things like ninja subclans, or if you want to play a quote unquote normal person, hint, they're not normal, that isn't a ninja, there's rules for that. But it also gives you another example of what those rules in play look like. So that by the time you read this 1 hour long screenplay like text, it's a very fun light read, you understand pretty much 90% of the game without even having read a single rule yet.
Yes, we talked about replays in one of the other interviews, so they explained what they are, how they came to be. I think they can be quite helpful.
Yeah, I have another interview out there. People look it up on YouTube where I talk about in depth about replays. They're one of the greatest inventions that Japan brought to the world RPG scene, in my opinion. Now we have video sessions and stuff like that. A lot of them are overproduced and they're nice and fun, but there's just something about just being able to read or skim through a text version of a real session that actually happened that's just really kind of cool. It just gets the brain working in ways that others don't, I think.
Yes, I mean, like have a teaser of an actual play session at the end of every episode to teaser the next country. So like a session in that language. But normally I never watch actual plays because they just take up so much time and I wouldn't concentrate 3 hours.
Yeah, that's basically it. Because you can read a little faster in your mind, but if you're listening to people do dialogue, especially really crunchy dialogue, you're at their liberty of having to sit through that, unless you maybe fast forward the video or something, if that's possible. But yeah.
So do you see any common features of Japanese role-playing games that might be different from English language ones?
Things have changed over time. So my answer 10 years ago would be different than my answer now. But I will say one thing is that since many years ago, at least 10, there's something called the Fear system. And Fear is the company that made Tenor Bancho originally, but they made some other games after that. And they kind of stumbled onto this rule system that got a lot of popularity in Japan that came out from this game called Alshard, which is kind of a Final Fantasy-esque game. It's a very anime, over-the-top-ish fantasy game with very cool classes and stuff like that. But its trick is that when you make a character, there's something like 10 to 20 quote-unquote character classes. And they each have these abilities that go from like levels 1 to level 10. And what you do is instead of saying, I'm a level 1 fighter, and I'm just going to advance in fighter, the idea is when you make a character, your starting character is 3 levels of something. And you can't take them all in one class. So you have to double dip in something. Now, I know in classic Dungeons & Dragons, multi-classing is usually not as great as just single classing. In these games, though, it's expected and it's actually just as powerful to have spread across. So basically, you might have like, I am a white wizard that has, healing abilities, and a martial artist and a monster tamer. Or there might be different types of magic. Like, okay, I'm going to be a level 2 ninja and a level 1 sorcerer or something like that. When you pick those classes, basically that determines your starting attributes, your skills that you get. You just copy them straight out of the book, your starting items and everything. So you basically just pick 2 levels of this and 1 level of that, or 1 level of this, 1 level of this, and 1 level of this. And you just go into those sections and you just write down. There's nothing to pick. There's no choices to be made. You just pick beyond what your character image is that you do when you define those classes. And once you do that, that defines everything you need to put into a character sheet, and then you're ready to start. So it's fast. It's fast, but you get to make a very interesting and complex strategic character that has different abilities. Usually each class doesn't just have these level 1 abilities, but they have this sort of core attribute ability that is like, fighter might be like, 1 time per day you get to throw a handful of dice on the table for an attack or something like that. That system became really popular, and then pretty much that company, Fear, really every single game it released after that had that same sort of system. And on top of that, a lot of people became used to that. So a lot of independently produced games also used a very similar system where it was just, instead of picking like single classes, you had to basically collect your character from multiple levels of different classes, whether it was a cyberpunk game, whether it was a high fantasy game, whether it was what kind of game it was. So that system, that idea of multiple classes and quickly making your character just by writing things down because those classes defined everything, that was a very Japanese thing that even lasts today. There's still games coming out using that system, and it's very popular. So that's definitely one Japanese quote-unquote trend that I have seen within Japan, but I haven't seen outside of Japan. One other is that while I see these days, there's a few authors that are making incredible sort of narrativist or story-focused games, like Fuyu-san, who does games like Stellar Knights, which is basically the best interpretation of an Utena RPG I've ever seen. I hope that gets released at some point. It's probably not going to be us. And there is this kind of trend of some games coming out that are very story-focused and also embrace that whole have a lot of replay at the front so you understand it before you get into the rules. So that's one trend. So basically, the Shinobigami sort of defined this trend of including the replay within the rules, usually at first, and then have the rules in back. So there's a lot of games by other publishers too, not just Boken, that produce Shinobigami, that are doing that same sort of method to get people understanding the game very quickly. But I would say one thing is that, I guess this isn't a trend because I see it everywhere, is even independent games, a lot of independent games, they always have like a strategic combat system, which usually has like a mat or just, combat abilities and stuff like that. I think it's probably that Fear influence. I'll stick with my previous two. The fear idea of cobble your character from 2 to 3 of multiple classes provided, and the other element, which was these games coming out recently from all companies that are in a very smaller form, like a hand-sized book that have the replay in front and rules, usually light, in the back, so that you have a very fast purchase to table ratio.
Okay, so the last question I wanted to ask, when you translate books, of course, about the translation itself, are there any things which were especially hard to translate?
Oh, God, yes. Yeah, so 2 things that come to mind. Ryutama was actually very easy because it was a very Western themed and it wasn't very complicated. But 2 that we had a lot of problems with were the Tenerbahce Zero and Shinobigami. Shinobigami, not as much. The one issue is that a lot of the abilities, a lot of the quote-unquote pulp ninja abilities in Japanese fiction are very poetic. And sometimes it's hard to make that poetry come out in English. So the word, like you'll see that in anime too. Someone says, I'm going to use my blankety blank ability. And it sounds kind of straightforward and silly in English, but in Japanese, it sounds very much more poetic and cool. I guess that's just a feature of the language. It's very hard. So we do our best with those, but we're always going to, there's been so many times where we're like, let's leave it in Japanese. We're leaving too much stuff in Japanese. We got to translate a few of these words into English. We'll do these in English. You know what? The original Japanese is better. Let's stick with the original Japanese. And then at some point we get confused with, wait, were we sticking with the original Japanese on this, or were we doing our translation? And we forget often, and we have to remind ourselves. We have to go back to this master document we created to remember, oh yeah, okay, this one we're going to keep this word as this. That word is going to be that. This word is going to be translated in English, etc. So that's kind of one interesting thing. But Tenerbahce Zero was difficult as all hell. I mean, I was much learning the language when I was going through it and translating it, but at a high level. But still, Tenerbahce Zero was written by someone who wanted to almost be more of a poet than a game designer. The rules are very straightforward, but the text explanations of the various classes and stuff, which define the world, were very poetic. And poetry in Japan means that you're using, very high-end concepts and old terms and old kanji and unused idioms and stuff like that. But on top of that, there's also, you're using old school Japanese grammar, which is in English. I don't know about German, but in English, we would get deducted if we have a sentence that doesn't have a subject because it doesn't make any sense. Or run-on sentences. Run-on sentences are bad. Embrace one concept in one sentence. If you have more, either put an and there, but if there's too much more beyond the and, consider splitting off into 2 or 3 sentences. In Japanese, omitting the subject and having a phrase of a sentence is poetic. Having extremely long run-on sentences that are about the size of a paragraph or more is very poetic. So those were brain melters to me. Like, for example, especially the run-on sentences in Japanese. By the time I get to the end of a paragraph-long run-on sentence in my mind, I'm like, okay, I understand what it says, but then I forgot what the first half of the thing I translated in my head was. So I actually had to write it out on paper. I couldn't just translate on my head, get the Japanese in my head, translate it in my head, and then put it back on paper. There was a lot of these very long sentences where I had to do it in parts. The first half of the sentence or the first quarter of the sentence, write that on the computer. Then the second part, write that on the computer. Third part, write that on the computer. Fourth part, write that on the computer. Then step back, look at it and go, oh, okay, I know what they mean. And then I reassemble it into usually not just one sentence, but like 5 sentences and then put it into English. Yeah, those are the 2 most difficult, I think. One thing that I'm really excited about is this. Back in the day when I was translating these games and publishing them, anyone who could speak or understand Japanese was funneling all their attention directly into anime and manga. There was no interest in Japanese RPGs. Basically, the people that, when I looked around and said, who else is interested in Japanese RPGs that can translate? The answer was it was me and one other person. Then it was 2 other people. Then it was 3 other people. Luckily, since the explosion of D&D, one thing that's been incredible is that there's more and more people entering the scene and some online translation tools. A little bit of AI translation is usually crap, but some of it is actually making things a little bit easier and faster to translate. In short, because of the explosion of D&D from Critical Role and stuff like that, there's now more interest in role-playing games. Because of that, not everyone who's interested in the Japanese language is rushing to anime and manga. Some people are interested in RPGs now these days, which means that there's more people and more companies creeping up that are licensing Japanese RPGs and producing them in English. I don't have to look at the Japanese RPG world and say, well, if I'm not doing it, no one's going to be doing it. Now there's these other entities popping up like Starline, Silverline, a couple others that are now bringing these wonderful games out into English. And I'm just loving it. We're going to see over the next maybe 10 years, we're going to see a lot more of the new, interesting, crazy, awesome Japanese games that are coming out these days. We're going to see them in English and be able to play them in English. And it's going to be wonderful. It's not just me doing it. It's all sorts of people. And I'm just excited to see what the future holds in that regard.
Foreigners in Japan have also done research on gaming in the country. So I talked to a German academic, and we actually had to watch out not to conduct this interview in German.
My full name is Björn Ole Kamm. I was born in Germany, in Heidelberg. Since 2015 now, I'm working at Kyoto University, the Graduate School of Letters, where I am a professor for transcultural studies. And this program is a bit of a special program. It's one of the only programs taught completely in English and is a so-called international joint degree program, meaning that we have an international partner, Heidelberg University, and our students, our master's students, spend 1 year in Kyoto and 1 year in Heidelberg and receive a degree from both institutions together. So I helped set up this program, and I'm now the coordinator of it. And transcultural studies, in short, questions the standard idea or standard image of cultures being territorially bound to the nation states. So it's a bit about questioning methodological nationalism and trying to unearth connections in the past, but also trying to look at current phenomena not from a nation-state lens, or not trying to put things into nation-state frame per se. For example, when I talk about role-playing games, I never say Japanese role-playing games. I always say role-playing games in and from Japan, because of the transcultural nature of flows of ideas, of people involved, and so on and so forth. And myself, I played role-playing games when I was in high school. So I played Dungeons & Dragons and mostly Vampire the Masquerade back in the day, but stopped playing when I entered my graduate studies. So I lost a little bit contact to that. But when I moved into my PhD studies, I wanted to do something different to what I had done before. Before, I was working a lot with manga and anime related to Japanese popular media. So one incentive was to rekindle my connection to role-playing games and have a look into role-playing games in Japan. So that's how I got into that. Originally, my study was about the otaku stereotype, which you can roughly translate as nerd or freak. It has found its way into most European languages as a label for someone who is a fan of Japanese popular media like anime, manga, and video games. But in Japanese has very different connotations, very different, I would say, lived reality, a different history of how the term came about. And still, when I said I wanted to show that the stereotype associated with otaku, that otaku are reclusive murderers in waiting, I wanted to show that this is not the case. And very soon I realized that this approach is not very new. So since 1989, every publication in English, Japanese, or German I encounter dealing with otaku starts with the same claim: all previous knowledge is wrong. And now the author would deliver the correct interpretation of who or what an otaku is, basically based on them being an authentic otaku themselves. So I soon moved away from this aim of showing that the stereotype is not true, because all my own assumptions also didn't match the lived reality in Japan. So the idea was then to show the relationship between role players and this label, this stereotype. But over the course of the study, this point of departure, this question about the stereotype, moved very much into the background. So it is still part of the study, but my focus shifted then more to how ideas travel, how concepts travel, who are the gatekeepers. So who brings knowledge into Japan in this case, or out of Japan? So people like, I think you spoke with him already, Andy Kitkowski, who has translated several originally Japanese tabletop role-playing games into English. So such figures were of interest to me. So the people of the first hour who encountered D&D in computer game magazines and then started playing themselves in the 1980s and so on. So I was interested in such shifts, interested in questions of adaptation, and to get a basic understanding of the history of the practice in Japan. And I particularly focus on the practice, So I didn't want to look at this from preconceived notions of the Japanese role-playing game community or the scene in Japan or something like that. I was just rather focusing on the practice, and I can talk a little bit more about what I mean with that later. But I was rather interested in what people took out of D&D, how they changed it for their own purposes, and the development of that. And after some time, I got very much interested into LARP in Japan. And my focus has since then shifted to LARP as a hobby, as an entertainment practice, but also as a way of conveying research results. So role-playing games are not the only thing I study, I research. I have, for example, researched also about hikikomori, social withdrawal, which is a huge topic in Japan. And so a colleague and I, we have done interviews with people who have been in withdrawal, with therapists, with parents, and translated their experiences into a live action role play, into a LARP, so that other people, third parties, can experience a little bit what the dilemmas are people in social withdrawal face. So this has become now the focus of much of my research, of trying to use LARP, live action role play, as a method and not just as the subject of my research. That's me in a nutshell.
There are a lot of points where I could pick up on that start at the end with the LARPs. It sounds almost to me like lessons from Nordic LARP. Is there a connection there?
Yes. So during my research, I encountered, of course, the Knutepunkt books and got sucked into that world, of course. So I have been to Knutepunkt Solmukohta several times and connected with the research there very much. And I forgot to mention one thing. I'm also co-editor of a peer-reviewed open access journal, the Journal of Analog Role-Playing Game Studies. We started in 2019, and it's a bilingual journal. So we have articles published in English and Japanese. And the main aim is to get people talking across these language barriers. And each year we also hold a symposium with simultaneous interpretation where people can exchange ideas and so on. And within the frame of the journal, we have also published, for example, a Japanese translation of the safety cards. So the X card and so on, line and veils and forward and so on. And several figures from the Nordic LARP scene discussions have also published articles with us. So there is definitely a connection.
And you said in your research you focus on practice. I hope I interpret this correctly. You said there might be things differently. So what things did you encounter where things in Japan are done differently than in the United States or in Europe when they play D&D, for example?
I observed some play sessions, but mostly I observed or participated in play sessions of role-playing games that had been published in Japanese. So I did not observe a D&D campaign or participate in a D&D play, for example. So here I can refer to the past, in essence. So when the people who started one of the first role-playing game studios back in the 1980s, namely Group SNE, which has its base in Kobe. One of the key figures is the translator Yasuda Hiroshi, who translated Terry Pratchett, for example, and also other science fiction stories. He was one of the first to encounter D&D in wargame and computer magazines. And when he and his friends started playing, they faced the problem that sometimes they didn't know what they could do within the confines of the game. And over time, playing these games, they thought that maybe other Japanese players would have the same problem. So that's when they started to release transcripts of their play sessions, but not just short excerpts, but complete transcripts, maybe a little bit edited, but usually showing the interaction between game master and players and having the rules explained in a footnote or dice rolls or anything like that. And this genre they created, they called replay, and turned into the most profitable part in Japan of role-playing game industry. So all game studios I talked to said that the replays are what makes the most money. and that the majority of people involved in role-playing games are readers of these replays rather than players. So if I wanted to point out such a difference, then it's this economic difference of the replays. I think we can see now outside Japan with the advent of Twitch and all these Let's Plays and actual plays and so on, culminating in franchises like Critical Role that had been in Japan already in existence since the 1980s in book form. It's a bit different to, for example, Dragonlance, which is also connected to actual play sessions, the novels and so on. But here they keep this interaction transcript format. And if you look at newer rule books, then usually they start with such a replay. So you would read maybe, 100 pages of replay and then get the rules for your own play. So this has become a core element of passive play and active play in Japan, which I would point to a major difference to the other markets I know. So in Germany, I have not encountered such a vivid culture of replay writing. Also, the non-professionals, so the amateur creators in Japan. I don't know if you're aware of the comic market. So it's a biannual event where amateur creators sell their manga, sell their games, sell their products. And here you have also a lot of replays. So where people sell their own play sessions, in essence. So that is what I observed as the difference. Another difference, again, goes back to the 1980s. So Yasuda Hitoshi and the others, they actually sought out TSR if they could publish a source book with their own world, sword world, in which they had been playing their own campaign world, as a supplement to D&D at the time. And as everybody familiar with TSR, licensing talks with them were not fun and it didn't go anywhere. So that resulted in them creating their own system, which became Sword World RPG, which through the 90s was the gold standard fantasy role-playing in Japan. So it's very classic setting with elves and orcs and dwarves and everything. But one key difference is, again, an economic one. Compared to D&D, it came in what is called in Japanese a tankobon, so a small paperback book, which was sold for 600 yen at the time. So roughly 3 to 4 euro, I would say, which is less than 15% of what the Japanese D&D books were sold at the time. So this was also then a key for them to reach middle schoolers and get a lot more players, which the D&D box would never have reached. And they are also using simple 6-sided dice instead of various polyhedral dice we know from D&D and other games. In essence, you could buy this paperback, grab some dice you had at home and play. So this was a key factor for them gaining a larger audience. And also other game studios are using not just dice, but for example, also trump cards for randomization, things people have at home already. So that was in the 90s.
So these replays, for which games are these popular in Japan?
Of course, you had a lot of Sword World RPG replays in the beginning. And as far as I can tell, all major game lines have a stable amount of replays by professionals as well as amateurs. So, for example, when I went to my very first Japan game convention, which was the tabletop role-playing game convention until mid-2010-ish, they had release sessions for new replay books in which you had famous voice actors from anime being the players. So a double sell, so to say. They not just saw the role-playing game, but also they got this connection to anime and so on. And these voice actors drew in, again, attention from potential buyers. And here, those who were most commercially active at the time was Far East Amusement Research, FEAR for short, who are responsible, for example, for Tenra Bansho, the game Andy Kitkovsky translated as one of the first role-playing games. It's a game set in a pseudo samurai medieval fantasy world that still has mecha robots and so on. So they were very, very active in this realm of hyping their replays and getting audience attention. Currently, the biggest focus is on Call of Cthulhu in Japan. So since around 2012-ish, we have a huge attention on Call of Cthulhu. So again, if I bring up an example from the comic market, in the comic market catalog, you have list of what kind of genre is sold when, and if I remember correctly, tabletop role-playing games or related items are sold during the Saturday. And in that day's entry, you have under the category Dengen Fuyo game, so games that don't need a power source. So analog games, you have tabletop or table talk role-playing games, and as explanation, Call of Cthulhu, etc. And until 2014, it was Dungeons & Dragons and Sword World that were listed here. Now it's just Call of Cthulhu because of the attention here. I must confess, I don't know what Chaosium's stance is on replays of Call of Cthulhu, but if I go to the game market, which is another event focusing on board games, card games, and role-playing games, then you have a huge amount of Call of Cthulhu replays and scenarios written by amateurs sold there. So outclassing everything else. You also have illustrations of Call of Cthulhu gods and whatever you can buy. There are some observations that differed from what I had, for example, as a player experienced before in Germany. And one concerned language. In Japanese, you have various levels of politeness, usually to express the relationship between the speakers. So, for example, you have a very polite language you use towards someone who is in status above you. And when you talk about yourself, you use a very humble language. And there are also some phrases, some expressions that are rather female connoted and others rather male. So one example is the word for I. There are very different words you can use for I. So the standard is watashi, but extra muscular men would probably say ore, which is not very polite, and so on. And similar, there are also some particles you end at the end of sentences that sound rather feminine than male. And you learn about this when you study Japanese at university and so on. But then you go out and in actual lived language practice, this is often no longer the case, that you have these strong connotations. So maybe that was in the 70s or so, but not today anymore. So many female players I encountered, they don't speak very feminine, so to say. But during role-playing, when people cross-play, so when, especially game masters, when they are male and play a female character and so on, they fall back onto this way of speaking. And in that space, it adds authenticity. So after play sessions, I interviewed female gamers and they said, yeah, maybe I'm not using such language myself, but during a play session, this is a very helpful tool to make sure I immediately understand the character I'm talking to is female, for example. And this brings me to another point that I guess you have in a lot of discussions about role-playing games as a scene, about which I don't want to say so much, but that it's a male hobby. You hear that for most countries. Would be interesting to know about Korea and China, by the way. But in the beginning of my research, I also had this strong impression. So when I went to conventions and so on, at times it was like 50-1, the ratio of male to female players. So when I also interviewed people why they think it's so male dominated, people said, oh, because of the complicated rules and so on. And that was, I think, also the time when Wizards of the Coast released this book for female gamers, where in essence it played into stereotypes that females like shopping. So here you can do shopping in role-playing games as well. So that was like the time when gender was a bit on the focus in various role-playing game discourses. And through my contacts, I encountered a lot of private role-playing groups, which were almost all female or half female in the ratio of participants. So the thing is that in public space, it's a very male-dominated hobby, but you can't say anything about the actual player base in general. But what I encountered is that there are a lot of female gamers. Some said, and also some male gamers said, they don't go to public events and conventions because of some toxic players there. So it's not just female players who stay away from these kind of events. I don't know how these events have changed now past pandemic. So this is pre-pandemic information. So we have the image of a male-dominated hobby in Japan as well. But I think in actuality, it's much more diverse. And if I now look at LARP, LARP is in public spaces predominantly female.
So I think it's pretty well known that Call of Cthulhu is hugely popular in East Asian countries. Do you have an explanation for why it's so popular in Japan?
I have no proof. I have only some signposts. And one is a anime series that came out in 2012. It's called Nyaruko, Crawling with Love. I don't know if it was ever translated into English. It was originally a light novel, so one of these types for a younger audience, the category into which also replays fall. So it was written by a pseudonym of the author, Ai Soramanta, and in 2012 and 2013, Studio Shebek made an anime out of this. And the story is not super interesting. It's about Nyaruko. Nyaruko is, in essence, the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep from Call of Cthulhu, which is here represented by a cute anime girl with silver hair who falls in love with a human high school boy and protects him and Earth against other monsters. So has not much to do with the Cthulhu mythos in itself, with exception that a few monsters and characters use names out of Call of Cthulhu. But this anime stands out in its self-awareness, so it's self-parodizing a lot, and it's very intertextual. So referencing, for example, a replay of the Call of Cthulhu game, namely Relay Antique by Chiyama, also from 2009. And my guess is, because most of my informants, be they game designers or ordinary players, suggested to me that the shift was around 2012, 2013 to the attention to Call of Cthulhu. And my guess is then that people watched this anime and wanted to find out, so what are these strange character names, or what is this replay? So if you Google it, you will happen upon replays or replay videos, which had also starting to pop up around 2010, 2011 in Japan on the Japanese YouTube equivalent, Nico Nico video, Nico Nico Doga. And if you look there for replay videos, the majority are Call of Cthulhu videos with millions of views that are the signs that point towards how people got an interest of Call of Cthulhu role-playing games. And Okada Atsuhiro, when he was still running the TRPG cafe in Kanda, Tokyo, he said that at some point, so that was still pre-pandemic, he got daily phone calls from university students as well as company workers who had heard of Call of Cthulhu and role-playing games and wanted an introductory session. This, including an interest into LARP, had them expand their business from a one-floor cafe into a three-floor establishment where they would run tabletop role-playing games, but also LARPs. This was a second boom, I would say, of tabletop role-playing in Japan, after the first boom being Sword World RPG among middle schoolers back in the 80s, early 90s.
So in the beginning, you said in your research you're very interested in not like fixed cultural or national borders, but the interplay. And as I said, there seems to be a lot of influence from the role-playing scene in Japan to other East Asian countries. Have you seen any signs of backwards influence, for example, from Korea to Japan or others?
In other areas, yes. So, K-pop and K-drama had their times in Japan. So it comes in waves. It's also called the Korean wave, actually, in Japanese. But concerning role-playing games, I must confess, I have not observed so much of an influx into Japan. So what I can see is that English language role-playing games are very much translated into Japanese. but with other games, not to my current knowledge. This is an anecdote. A British group wanted to do a Shogun LARP based on the novel by what's his name?
Henry Cavill, because I just yesterday saw an advertisement here in Istanbul. Apparently they do a new series based on it.
Yes. So they wanted to do a Shogun LARP based on the novel. And they were very much afraid of cultural appropriation. So they wanted feedback from Japanese role players. And the problem is, the random Japanese role player you may find will probably have no idea what is correct about 16th century Japanese customs, or may know as much as those people reading Shogun, for example. So if you are about accuracy and historical correctness, maybe you should better speak to, I don't know, an Indonesian specialist on that era. When I talked to Japanese LARPers about this, they said, oh, we don't care. It's great that they are playing with Japanese culture. So we don't mind if it's not correct. So those were the people from the Japanese LARP Association, CLOS, who were just like, oh, yeah, cool, just play with it. I find it often difficult to seek confirmation from a native if it's about specialist knowledge. So if you asked me about some specialist knowledge concerning German history, I would also not be able to verify anything. But here, the advice the British group got was just make sure that you say it's based on the novel and not on history. And the novel is a fictionalization in the first place, borrowing from Japanese history to some degree, but is full of mistakes itself. But I have not asked, I must say, and I have not been told by any Japanese designer or player I talked to that they found anything not to their liking in these pseudo-Japanese, pseudo-Asian supplements.
Finally, I talked to an expert who is in the process of opening a gaming shop in Japan.
So my name's David. I'm the founder and owner, which always sounds fancy, of Warstorm Games, a new war game and board game shop in Japan. So I think I got started with role-playing games back when I was maybe 10 or 11 with one of the early edition of Warhammer Fantasy role-playing games. I want to say maybe second or third edition. Lots and lots of dice, lots and lots of rules. Probably made a lot of mistakes when I was that age. But yeah, that was my first kind of adventure into the games.
And which other games have you played since then?
Oh, wow. Since then, a fair bit. So I used to work for Firestorm Games back in the UK, and we had a regular roleplay group meeting pretty much once or twice a week. So I've gone through the usual kind of Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, but we've done Call of Cthulhu, Werewolf, Vampire, that whole series, Mage. Probably more games I've forgotten than can remember off the top of my head. But yeah, probably most of the main ones, except for I haven't played Traveller. That's probably the one big one I haven't done.
So you're from the UK originally?
Yeah, I know. It's a big giveaway, my accent. I'm from the UK. I've been in Japan now for 8 years. And I'm married to a nice Japanese lady. I've got Japanese kids. So I'm very, very much ingrained in Japan now. But yeah, from the UK originally.
Okay, let's start with the ingrained in Japan. So if you play in Japan, do you play with other foreigners or do you play in Japanese?
It's a mix, actually. Me and another friend in our local area, we started a regular game group. Unfortunately, we had to stop when COVID hit. But before that, we were again meeting up once a month to play games, and that was in another board game shop over in Shizuoka City. That was a huge mix. So pretty much you've got all the local Japanese gamers, a lot of the typically English teachers from the area as well would come down, and then just people on holiday would maybe see the adverts, see the events, and come and play as well. So a nice mix of languages. We've had Filipinos, Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, and English speakers all come and participate.
Did you notice any differences in playing style?
That is a good question. So one thing that was quite amusing at the time, when we had a lot of Filipinos playing Werewolf at the time, so they very much grouped together. there was a lot of cooperation, and if there was a sort of a chance to backstab people, they were very much, we're Filipino, he's not, get him. So that was quite fun. But otherwise, I think there's not a huge difference in the way people play. I suppose, again, this is obviously such a small selection of players, but some of the Japanese players were maybe more focused on the numbers and the sort of the technical abilities of the characters that they were playing, while maybe more of the Westerners, typically, say, Americans and British people, maybe more into the character and the role-playing side of things. But again, that's obviously a sample of like 10, 15 people.
So the shop is already open, or are you still planning it?
So the shop is opening March 30th, last weekend of March.
Okay, and is there a special concept, or is it like a regular store?
Well, I suppose in some ways it's a little bit special just because of where I am in Japan, because I'm not in Tokyo. I'm out in Shizuoka, which is a bit more sort of countryside. So lovely views, but not a lot of game shops around here. So I'm going to be stocking and supplying a lot of games that just haven't really been supplied to Japan before. So although it moves away a bit from the roleplay system, I'm going to be stocking Warlord games. So things like World War II stuff, 2000 AD, things like that, which, there's no other shop in Japan with that. Then on top of that, I'm providing quite a large space for people to actually come and play, which there's been a few dedicated board game spaces in like Shizuoka and also across Japan. But if you leave Tokyo, you're pretty much limited to just board game spaces. So the fact that if people want to come and use a table for roleplay games, want to use it for tabletop war games or board games, is a bit special.
So you'll also have role-playing games. Would these be Japanese or English versions, or both?
I'm hoping to expand into both. I'm not going to be selling the rulebooks in the store itself. From a sales perspective, I'm mostly focusing on war games, so models, paints, that kind of stuff. But for the player experience side of things, I'm going to have a library of board games people can play with, and then also I've got a collection of role-play rulebooks. So if people want to try out a new system, want to try and organize a group, they'll have all the resources available in the store. So I definitely want to have Japanese added to that. I've got a lot of English books already. So that'll be my own collection available. And then, if there's the interest, definitely Japanese as well.
So what's without going into the figures, but the business model, like do people pay for using a table, or are you mostly planning on selling things? How does it work in Japan?
So I think it's pretty universal from what I've seen when I was doing my sort of market research. A lot of the information came from sort of American game shops and stuff like that. I'm focusing on the retail side of things is more of an online experience. So while I'll have physical stock in the store for people who are browsing, most of those sales I think will be an online thing. So no, the store itself is more of a front for people. Fronts are terrible. That sounds like sort of mafia. It's a front. It's a place for people to come and socialize. And for that, they'll pay an entry fee for the time. So I'm running a little bit of a different system to the other shops I've seen in Japan, where they tend to either make you pay in advance for a table and you pay for the maximum number of players that could theoretically use it, or they make you pay per hour. So I'm just going for a day pass system. So basically you turn up, it's a flat fee, not super expensive, like cheaper than most of the places if you stayed for like 2 or 3 hours, and then you're free to sort of come and go as you want throughout that day and play. I'm also offering 6 monthly and yearly memberships. So if people want to be sort of regular players, there's benefits to sort of just investing up front and then coming and going as you want.
So if you did some market research, which games are the most popular in Japan, and are there differences between the expats and the local people there?
Yeah, so again, if you're talking about sort of gaming in general, most of the Japanese players when it comes to tabletop games are very Games Workshop focused. So that's the one that had a reasonable push into the country. And although they took a bit of a battering a few years back and had to sort of retreat into Tokyo again, they've actually re-established themselves really well. And a lot of the hobbyists are sort of focused around sort of Warhammer and Warhammer Fantasy. For the roleplay side of things, there's a couple of native Japanese game makers who've done like a little series. You see those quite a lot in the local hobby shops that sort of sell the Gundams and stuff. They're not really board game specialists, but they stock that stuff as well. But I think Dungeons & Dragons, again, is probably the one that most people know. And they actually recently, I say recently, probably the last 5 years or so, actually had a dedicated push to try and get into the Japanese market. So they rebranded themselves and their advertising specifically to try and appeal to the Japanese market. So you see these absolutely crazy Dungeons & Dragons adverts that feel very sort of Final Fantasy anime style adventure. And that was their attempt to break into that market. And I think they've done pretty well for themselves. Like most of the Japanese players who I've seen and spoken to about, they know D&D. That's the one they can talk about.
So do you know when they play D&D, if they play it in a different way than Western players?
So again, I've not had a huge experience of playing D&D with Japanese people, but the big one that I've noticed is it tends to be more technical gaming. So while maybe, again, there's probably a huge split in the Western community as well, but I've played with groups of foreigners, let's say, who like a very sort of role-play heavy game and who like a very kind of dungeon crawl style game. With the Japanese players I've played with, it's always been more leaning towards a very traditional go through the dungeon, roll for loot, kill the boss, and then sort of the aftermath is very much sort of dice rolls and less sort of storytelling, more murder hobo style, busting through things. There's quite a lot available from Dungeons & Dragons in Japanese. So one of the specialist hobby shops, so they have sort of anime goods, but board games and roleplay games feature in that. And yeah, they carry quite a lot of the Dungeons & Dragons supplements in Japanese. And I guess because there's not that sort of history of narrative-driven role-playing games that I'm aware of in Japan, that's probably why they sit down and they just play through as it is, sort of step by step. You play in the dungeon, you go through the dungeon room by room, and they don't really look to expand outside of that environment. Again, might come back to that sort of tradition of Final Fantasy style games, that very sort of turn-based, I do my move, you do your move sort of style of playing. That would be my guess. I think it's really interesting to see how a lot more game companies are trying to come back to Japan now. So I think we will probably see a lot more systems maybe getting translations, or a lot more advertising trying to pick up some of the bilingual players in the country. Because, you know, there is hopefully people don't get offended by the word, a huge nerd culture in Japan. And obviously it's a very unique and homegrown style of nerd culture, which it can be a bit jarring if you're not used to it. But, you know, the interest is there in games, in fantasy, in that escapism that comes from it. So I think a lot of companies are realizing that it's quite a large percentage, I think, are interested in this kind of escapism that is provided by games. There's been more game shops opening up. Games Workshop, as I said before, they've managed to sort of begin again a more carefully planned kind of expansion back into the country. They've got a lot more third-party stockists opening up. They're opening their own stores, but they're doing it in a way that consolidates the interest in the community. Whereas I think when they first came over here, it was a bit more of a sort of a scattershot of get as many stores as we possibly can, go, 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 and that didn't work because people had no idea what it was and it just fell flat. But no, I think now that they've established themselves, I think that's really going to open the door for a lot of other big companies and then smaller companies to do the same.
And the Legend of the Five Ring game Have you seen that played in Japan, or will you stock it, or what's your opinion on that one?
So I have it. I've played not the most recent version. I played one of the older Five Rings back in the day. I've not seen anything Five Rings in Japan. So even like with the card game, you get all the big card games here. Obviously, Pokemon is huge, but you got Magic the Gathering. You've got Yu-Gi-Oh! Is obviously massive because that came from here. And then I've even seen some of the older card games like Netrunner, like living card games. So I would have thought Legend of the Five Rings would be perfect to try and sell in Japan, especially with the new living card game style release. And yeah, not seen a single thing, English or Japanese.
So thank you for listening to the World of RPGs. A special thanks goes out to the role players in Japan who talked to me. The intro music was by Thomas Mutsu. And as always, you can find links to the games and everything else in the show notes. I'm of course not the first person investigating the Japanese gaming scene, so you will also find extensive interviews and histories about gaming in Japan there. For example, Andy Kitkowski has also been interviewed on the Don't Stop Thinking YouTube channel. Please subscribe and review wherever you find this podcast. For the next episode, I wanted to return to Europe, but then a gamer from an Asian country we already covered contacted me because they are from a city where most gamers speak a different language from my previous interviewees in that country, and the hobby also developed slightly differently there. So the following session you'll hear is using D&D rules, but setting it in that particular city in 1880.
我見過你冇喺度出現過啫，呢度九龍城寨嚟嘅喎，你啲咁嘅弱質女流嚟呢度做乜嘢啊？
我阿叔話喺九龍城等我咯。
你見到
我有人接應㗎。
你見到阿世傑咧，隻眼咧係瞳孔放大咗咁樣啦，咁佢而家有啲蟹。你阿叔即係邊個啊？
我阿叔咪我阿叔咯。你喂，叔叔你個眼神咁恐怖嘅？
阿女，你諗多咗啦，我冇事。做咩 CD 啊？咁佢我遞啲鴉片俾你。
我睇你食大煙食到咁啊，我仲夠膽食，我就真係傻咗啦。
試下啦，你乜嘢嘅煩惱都會唔記得咗㗎。
去，我啊而家除咗揾我阿叔，我冇煩惱。你咁恐怖㗎，我都係揾前面個姐姐傾下偈先。